assume the right break will eventually come along, that the right person will notice them, or that the right situation will appear and open the door that has stayed closed. Because of that expectation, people often spend long stretches of time waiting instead of building anything. They hold back their effort while watching the horizon, hoping for the moment when conditions finally become favorable. They believe progress will begin once the perfect opportunity arrives. And until that moment shows up, they allow themselves to stay in a holding pattern. The problem with this pattern is that waiting has a way of disguising itself as patience. A person can easily convince themselves they are simply letting time work in their favor. They may tell themselves the opportunity has not appeared yet, that the circumstances are not quite right, or that the timing will eventually improve if they just give things enough room to develop. Even though that kind of thinking may sound reasonable, it often keeps people standing still much longer than they realize. Days quietly turn into months. Months gradually become years, and the direction of a life begins to drift without someone fully noticing what is happening. Waiting starts to feel comfortable because it postpones the responsibility of making difficult decisions. The belief that someone will eventually arrive and change things can show up in many different forms. Some people believe a mentor will appear who will recognize their potential and guide them towards success. Others believe a lucky opportunity will suddenly open a path that had not existed before. Still others believe that better circumstances will eventually replace the problems they are dealing with right now. Even though these expectations may sound harmless, they create a way of thinking that keeps responsibility just slightly out of reach. When someone believes progress depends on something outside arriving, they naturally delay the effort that would move them forward. Their attention stays fixed on the possibility of rescue instead of the need to take initiative. At some point, though, a moment of clarity begins to appear. Sometimes it comes slowly, after years of watching and thinking. And other times it shows up suddenly, through experience. A person starts to realize that the arrival they have been waiting for does not seem to be getting any closer. The opportunity they expected someone else to provide never appeared, and the direction of their life is still exactly where their own decisions left it. That realization can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes a comforting illusion. It takes away the quiet belief that progress is simply delayed until the right person arrives. When that illusion disappears, something becomes clear that had always been there but had never been fully acknowledged. The direction of a life has always depended on the choices made each day. The progress someone has been waiting for has always been connected to the actions they were willing or unwilling to take. No outside arrival was ever responsible for creating that movement. This understanding does not appear to discourage someone. In many ways, it actually frees them. When a person realizes that no one else is coming to change their direction, the waiting finally stops. The horizon they had been watching loses its importance, and their attention begins to move towards something much more powerful. They start looking at what they themselves can build. Once the waiting disappears, time begins to look very different. Instead of watching the calendar pass while hoping circumstances will change, people start asking what they can do today that might influence tomorrow. The focus moves away from expectation and toward initiative. This is where many people start discovering something important about progress. Movement rarely begins with dramatic opportunities or extraordinary conditions. Most of the time, it begins with small decisions made consistently by someone who has stopped waiting for someone else to take control. When someone understands that no one is coming, they begin paying closer attention to their daily actions. They start noticing that every hour carries a choice about how it will be used. They see that effort applied today quietly shapes the results that appear months and years later. Instead of hoping circumstances will eventually change, they begin asking how their own decisions might create those changes. Instead of looking for someone to open a door, they start looking for ways to build one. Instead of watching time pass, they begin directing how that time will be invested. The end of waiting marks an important shift in a person's life. It replaces passive expectation with active responsibility. It replaces the hope that someone will step in with the understanding that progress begins through initiative. Once that shift happens, the future stops looking like something that simply arrives on schedule. It begins to look like something that responds to effort, discipline, and thoughtful decisions. The moment waiting ends is often the same moment progress quietly begins. Many people spend years hoping change will arrive from the outside, yet the people who eventually move forward discover a different truth. The most important arrival in their life was never going to come from someone else. It begins the moment they decide to begin. As people move through life, they often absorb certain expectations without realizing how deeply those expectations shape the way they think. Many of these beliefs are never formally taught, yet they slowly become part of someone's outlook through repeated experience. Over time, these assumptions quietly influence how people interpret problems, opportunities, and responsibility. During childhood, most problems are handled by someone else. When something goes wrong, parents step in with guidance, teachers provide direction, and authority figures offer solutions that keep things moving forward. A young person becomes used to the idea that when something becomes confusing or difficult, someone with more experience will eventually show up and help fix it. There is nothing wrong with that structure during the early years of life. Guidance is necessary while someone is still learning how the world works. Advice, instruction, and protection help people develop the knowledge and skills they will rely on later. However, if this pattern continues without being questioned for too long, it can quietly shape expectations that no longer help someone once they reach adulthood. Many people carry forward the belief that solutions will eventually come from somewhere outside themselves. They may expect an employer to determine the direction of their progress. They may believe fortunate circumstances will appear at the right moment. Others assume that if they simply remain patient, some outside force will eventually move things forward. This mindset usually is not caused by laziness or a lack of intelligence. In many cases, it develops because people have spent much of their life watching problems being solved by others. The mind becomes familiar with the idea that responsibility for fixing things belongs somewhere beyond the person experiencing the problem. As a result, people may unconsciously wait for help even when none is coming. The idea that someone will eventually step in can show up in subtle ways. A person may believe the right connection will suddenly change their career. Someone else may assume one lucky opportunity will instantly improve their circumstances. Others convince themselves that luck will eventually bring the breakthrough they have been hoping to see. Because of these expectations, people sometimes overlook the quiet opportunities already around them. Their attention stays focused on the dramatic event that might appear in the future rather than on the practical actions available right now. They wait for the extraordinary moment while ignoring the ordinary efforts that slowly build progress. The problem with this illusion is that it shifts responsibility away from the person living the life. If someone believes change depends on the arrival of something outside their control, they naturally feel less urgency about directing their own effort. Progress becomes something that might happen instead of something that must be built. Over time, this way of thinking can create a subtle kind of dependency. Instead of asking what they themselves can do to influence the direction of their life, people begin asking who or what might eventually help them do it. The question quietly shifts from personal initiative to outside assistance. Yet, the world rarely works according to that expectation. Circumstances do not organize themselves around someone's potential. Opportunities do not always arrive on schedule. And help does not always appear at the moment it would be most convenient. The direction of a life is usually shaped by actions taken long before favorable conditions appear. At some point, people begin noticing something important. The ones who seem to move forward consistently are not always the ones with the best circumstances. They are not always the ones with the most connections, the best starting point, or the most fortunate conditions. More often, they are the people who stopped expecting someone else to organize their progress. Instead of waiting for guidance to appear, they began creating their own direction. Instead of hoping an opportunity would show up, they began developing the ability to recognize and act on the opportunities already in front of them. This shift does not mean that help, cooperation, or advice have no value. Assistance from others can be extremely helpful when it appears. Guidance can speed up learning, and partnerships can expand what someone is capable of achieving. However, those things become powerful only when they support someone who has already taken responsibility for their own direction. When a person finally sees through the idea that someone else will rescue them, something very important changes. They stop organizing their life around the expectation that someone else will eventually provide the next step. They begin to realize that the responsibility for building that step has always belonged to them. Instead of asking who will create the opportunity, they begin asking how they might create it themselves. Instead of waiting for circumstances to improve, they start improving the way they use the circumstances they already have. Instead of hoping someone will guide their progress, they begin learning how to guide it on their own. This realization does not remove difficulty from life. Challenges still appear, obstacles still exist, and progress still requires effort. What changes is the way someone responds to those conditions. They stop looking outward for rescue and begin looking inward for direction. The illusion disappears, and responsibility quietly returns to the place where it had always belonged. Once that understanding settles into someone's thinking, the way they look at the future begins to change. They no longer measure progress by what others decide to provide. Instead, they begin measuring progress by the effort they're willing to invest and the decisions they are willing to make. The moment someone realizes that their future will not be built by outside forces is a powerful moment. It closes the chapter of waiting for rescue and opens the chapter of personal responsibility. From that point forward, progress becomes something a person builds rather than something they expect to receive. When someone finally realizes that no one else is responsible for directing their life, an important shift begins to take place in the way they think about responsibility. What once seemed like a heavy burden slowly starts to look very different. Instead of feeling like a weight that limits them, responsibility begins to feel like a tool that gives them control over their direction. For a long time, many people move through life believing that responsibility for major outcomes belongs somewhere outside themselves. They assume other people, organizations, or circumstances will eventually determine how far they're able to go. Because of that belief, they often underestimate how much influence their own decisions have over the direction their life takes. The moment that illusion disappears, something interesting happens. Responsibility no longer sits outside, waiting to be assigned by someone else. It moves directly into their hands, and once it arrives there, the way someone approaches life begins to change. Instead of waiting for instructions, they begin making decisions. Instead of looking around for permission, they begin trusting their judgment. Instead of assuming someone else will eventually organize their future, they begin realizing that the organization of their life has always depended on their own choices. This moment can feel surprising because it removes the final excuse for waiting. When someone believes another person is responsible for the next step, delay can feel justified. It becomes easy to assume progress must simply wait until the proper direction appears. Once responsibility becomes personal, delay begins to look very different. Time no longer feels like something that can be comfortably postponed. Each day begins to carry clearer meaning because someone understands their future is quietly being shaped by the decisions made during those hours. The way people view opportunity begins to change as well. When responsibility sits somewhere else, opportunities appear to be rare events that must be discovered or provided by others. A person may spend years hoping one big breakthrough will appear and instantly change the direction of their life. However, when responsibility moves into their own hands, opportunity starts to look less like a rare arrival and more like something that can be created. People begin noticing that progress is usually built through simple actions, repeated consistently, rather than dramatic events that appear out of nowhere. They begin paying closer attention to how they spend their time. They start evaluating their habits more honestly. They become more aware of the connection between the effort they invest today and the results that show up months or years later. This shift in perspective changes the way someone approaches effort. Instead of seeing effort as something that must only be applied when circumstances demand it, they begin recognizing effort as the main tool for shaping results. The energy they put into their work, their learning, and their discipline begins to feel like an investment rather than a temporary requirement. Responsibility changes the way people interpret difficulty. When someone believes another person is managing the direction of their life, challenges often appear as interruptions. Obstacles can feel like unfair events preventing progress from happening. Once responsibility becomes personal, those same challenges start to look different. Obstacles become signals that effort must increase, skill must improve, or strategy must change. Instead of waiting for someone else to solve the problem, people begin asking what actions they can take to move through it. This shift in thinking changes how someone looks at time too. The future is no longer something distant that will eventually arrive, regardless of their involvement. Instead, it becomes something that is quietly forming through the decisions they make every day. A person who understands this begins treating time with greater respect. Each day becomes an opportunity to strengthen their position or weaken it. The difference between those two outcomes usually comes from the choices made during ordinary moments that might otherwise seem unimportant. What makes this realization powerful is that it replaces uncertainty with clarity. When someone believes outside forces control their progress, the future feels unpredictable. They must wait to see what others decide, what opportunities appear, or what circumstances change. When responsibility belongs to them, the future becomes easier to understand. It becomes a reflection of discipline, decisions, and the willingness to act when action is required. Progress begins to feel less mysterious because its cause becomes clearer. At that point, something important begins happening in a person's life. They stop looking for someone else to direct their path and begin directing it themselves. Instead of wondering what might happen next, they begin deciding what they will do next. This change rarely starts with dramatic announcements or big declarations. It usually begins quietly through small decisions, repeated consistently. A person decides to use their time more intentionally. They decide to improve the way they approach their work. They decide to strengthen habits that support progress. Over time, those decisions begin producing results that once seemed unlikely. The direction of a life starts changing, not because someone else arrived to manage it, but because the person accepted the responsibility that had always been there waiting. This is why the moment someone realizes that no one is coming is not a moment of discouragement. It is a moment of awakening. Responsibility returns to the person, and with it comes the ability to influence the direction of life in ways they may never have considered before. When that turning point arrives, the future stops feeling like something that must be waited for. It becomes something that can finally be directed. Once a person understands that responsibility for their direction belongs completely to them, another realization begins to follow. If no one else is managing the course of their life, then someone must step into the role of guiding it. That role cannot remain empty for long, because without direction, time and circumstances will quietly decide the path on their own. For many people, this is the moment when the idea of leading themselves begins to appear. Leadership is usually associated with guiding other people, organizing teams, or directing large efforts toward a shared goal. But before someone can lead others well, they first have to learn how to lead themselves. Leading yourself begins with something simple but powerful. It begins with deciding to set standards for your own behavior. Instead of letting moods, circumstances, or outside pressure decide what actions will be taken each day, a person starts deciding what standards they will live by. This can include deciding how they will approach their work, how they will spend their time, or how they will respond when difficulties appear. These choices may seem small at first, but they quietly create the structure that shapes the direction of a life. Without standards, behavior tends to drift toward whatever feels easiest in the moment. People often follow convenience rather than intention, and convenience rarely produces meaningful results. Leading yourself begins when someone realizes their daily actions need to be guided by purpose instead of temporary comfort. One of the most important parts of leading yourself is discipline. Discipline is often misunderstood as something harsh or restrictive, but in reality, it works more like a stabilizing force. It allows someone to keep moving toward their goals, even when excitement fades or circumstances become difficult. Many people wait for motivation before they take action. They believe progress will become easier once they feel inspired or energized enough to begin. The problem with that approach is that motivation is unpredictable. It may show up strongly one day and disappear the next. Discipline works differently. It does not depend on changing emotions. It depends on decisions that were already made ahead of time. When someone decides in advance how they will spend their time, how they will handle their responsibilities, and what standards they will maintain. Discipline becomes the structure that keeps those decisions moving forward. Another important part of leading yourself is personal accountability. When someone expects other people to guide their life, it becomes easy to blame outside conditions when progress slows down. They might point to difficult circumstances, bad timing, or a lack of opportunity as the reason nothing is moving forward. Leading yourself removes that habit of thinking. Instead of looking for reasons why something cannot be done, people begin asking what adjustments might allow progress to continue. Responsibility for improvement returns to the person making the effort. This does not mean life suddenly becomes easy or predictable. Challenges still appear, and setbacks still happen. The difference is how someone responds to those situations. Instead of waiting for someone else to fix the problem, they begin asking what actions they can take to influence the outcome. And leading yourself requires clarity about direction. Someone who plans to guide their own life eventually has to decide what kind of life they are trying to build. Without some sense of direction, effort can easily scatter across activities that produce very little progress. When people take time to think about the direction they want their life to move, their daily decisions begin lining up with that vision. The way they spend their time becomes more intentional. The habits they develop begin supporting the results they hope to achieve. Over time, this connection between intention and action begins producing visible results. Progress that once felt slow or uncertain begins gaining momentum. Someone starts to see that steady effort in a clear direction has a powerful compounding effect. You see, leading yourself creates a new level of independence. When someone learns how to guide their own behavior, they become less dependent on outside pressure to stay on track. They no longer need constant reminders, supervision, or encouragement to keep moving forward. Instead, the direction of their life is supported by internal commitment. The standards they have chosen guide their behavior, even when no one else is watching. Their progress becomes the result of personal discipline rather than outside control. This transformation does not happen overnight. It develops gradually through repeated decisions that strengthen a person's ability to guide themselves. Each time someone follows through on a commitment, that ability becomes a little stronger. Eventually, people begin noticing that the structure of their life has changed. Waiting has been replaced with action. Uncertainty has been replaced with direction, and dependence has been replaced with personal leadership. What once felt like a life directed by circumstances becomes a life directed by intention. The person who once waited for someone else to organize their future becomes the person who now organizes it themselves. When that shift happens, people stop looking outward for someone to lead the way. They begin to understand that the most important leadership they will ever experience is the leadership they practice over their own life. After someone realizes that no one else will arrive to build their future for them, another change begins to happen in the way they think about what lies ahead. The future no longer looks like something that will simply appear on its own. Instead, it begins to look like something that must be built piece by piece through effort, decisions, and persistence. Many people spend years imagining the life they hope to live. They picture the opportunities they want to have, the stability they want to reach, and the kind of work they hope to be known for. But imagination alone rarely creates those conditions. A vision can inspire someone, but actually building that vision requires steady action over long periods of time. When someone accepts that their future will not be assembled by outside forces, their attention shifts toward the work of building. They start asking different questions than before. Instead of wondering when life will improve, they begin asking what actions today might move that improvement forward. This shift in thinking creates a sense of ownership over the way a person approaches their days. Time stops feeling like something that simply passes. Each day becomes a piece of the structure that will eventually shape the direction of their life. The way those days are used begins to matter much more. Building a life is not very different from building anything else that has value. The finished result is rarely created through one dramatic effort. More often, it appears gradually as smaller parts are carefully put together over time. Each step may look small by itself, but the accumulation of those steps eventually produces something meaningful. For many people, the challenge is recognizing how important those small steps really are. It is easy to underestimate consistent effort because the results do not always appear immediately. Someone may spend time learning new skills, improving their work habits, or strengthening their discipline without seeing instant proof that those efforts are working. But progress often happens beneath the surface, long before it becomes visible. Skills grow quietly through practice. Reputation develops slowly through reliability. Opportunities begin appearing as the result of abilities that were developed months or even years earlier. What once looked like small efforts begins creating outcomes that would not exist without them. When someone accepts the responsibility of building their own life, they start recognizing the value of these gradual improvements. They understand the life they want cannot be created through occasional bursts of effort. It must be supported by consistent actions repeated over time. This perspective encourages people to think carefully about the decisions they make every day. If the future is being built through daily behavior, then those behaviors deserve serious attention. The habits a person repeats become the tools that shape the direction of their life. Some habits strengthen that structure, while others quietly weaken it. Productive habits create stability and progress, while careless habits slowly damage the foundation of future success. Seeing this connection encourages people to choose their actions more intentionally. Another important part of building a life is taking ownership of outcomes. When someone believes others are responsible for their circumstances, it becomes easy to blame outside forces when progress slows down. But when someone accepts responsibility for construction, results begin to look different. Success becomes the result of effort applied wisely, and setbacks become signals that something needs to change. Instead of seeing difficulties as unfair interruptions, people begin looking at how their preparation, decisions, or persistence might be improved. This approach turns setbacks into lessons instead of excuses. Every challenge provides information that can strengthen the structure being built. Mistakes become part of the process rather than proof that progress cannot happen. Over time, this way of thinking produces something many people search for but rarely find through waiting alone. It produces momentum. Each small improvement begins supporting the next one. Skills improve, discipline strengthens, and opportunities begin appearing more often because the person has become better prepared to recognize and act on them. What once seemed like distant goals slowly move closer through steady effort. The future that once felt uncertain begins taking shape through deliberate construction. Someone who once hoped life would eventually change begins realizing they are the one creating those changes. This realization brings a powerful sense of ownership over the direction of life. Instead of feeling like a passenger carried by circumstances, people begin to feel like the builders of their own path. They understand the structure they are creating may take years to fully appear, but each day adds another piece to its foundation. The day someone realizes that no one is coming often becomes the same day they begin building the life they once believed someone else would provide. The responsibility may feel heavy at first, but it quickly reveals something far more encouraging. The life being built is uniquely their own. It reflects their effort, their decisions, and their willingness to take responsibility for what they create. No one else could build that structure in exactly the same way. And because they are the one building it, they are also the one capable of continuing to improve it.